when you strip the commute out of it, you strip the getting dressed for work out of it, you strip the parties. I used to go to a lot of events. I used to go to a lot of drinks and dinners and lunches. Once all that goes away, you realize what the job is. Like, I think that's a unique moment that you have to say, okay, what am I really doing? And is this what I want to continue to be doing? And it was a really good time to do that.
This is the Changeup. I'm Keith Hernandez. On this episode, we welcome Shareen Pathak, the co-founder of Toolkits. Toolkits is a business information and consulting company providing practical guidance, resources, and insights that drive business outcomes. What does that mean? Well, where traditional consultancies offer platitudes and high-level thinking, Toolkits is providing real detailed resources for businesses to create original content. A seasoned editor and reporter at Digiday, Ad Age, and Dow Jones, Shareen is passionate about publishing done well, and we get into the nitty-gritty on how brands are working in this new reality. Shareen, what's up? It's so good to have you on. How are you?
I'm good. It's so good to be on here. Thank you so much, Keith.
Yeah, so you just launched Toolkits in September, co-founder of Toolkits with Jack Marshall. Walk us through it. Tell us a little bit about what Toolkits is and what it's going to do to the world.
Yeah, it's going to do big things. I mean, in a nutshell, Toolkits is combining information and consulting in a way that we think about this in. We provide practical guidance for professionals that want to do something great. And that something great can be professionals in different careers, different parts of their careers, different stages of their careers, and different industries. And what we do is we make practical guidance, we make resources, and we make insights that always, and this is sort of the key part, always drive business outcomes. We are officially only a few weeks in, but like with most things, and I'm sure most guests you've had on here, we've been thinking about this for what feels like just years and years. But yeah, we just launched and we're excited to get going.
Well, congratulations. And so what was some of that thinking, right? Prior to going out on your own, you were an editor at Digiday, launching new products, launching new initiatives at Digiday, as well as, you know, the day-to-day work of covering advertising and media. What were those conversations that you're having that you realized this is maybe something the world needs?
I think there's sort of a couple of problems, I think, that Jack and I both noticed sort of individually and then kind of together when we sort of came together and started thinking about this. I think the first one, I find it really hard to describe this one, but you can help me sort of when you hear it. I think as journalists, we've understood why good unbiased content makes a difference. And I think that's really true today. We're talking about sort of a context in which sort of there's all these fragmented sources of information. There's a lot of information on the internet. A lot can be presented very well, but doesn't really have sort of the data or the sourcing to back it up. And we've both seen in our careers that when we wrote a story that was unbiased, it was fact-checked, and that was powerful, that it made a difference. It made a difference in someone's lives. It made a difference, hopefully, even in someone's career. In some cases, you know, if we'd written a story about certain issues, it caused executives, like big executives at publishers like yourselves in your past life, kind of to come out and say, wait, we should be doing something because they're saying something's wrong. So I think that was sort of the first thread that I pulled out. I think the second one is kind of, we live in sort of a world where there's an abundance of this poor quality and misleading information out there. And it's sort of a context in which kind of there's a lot of Twitter threads, there's a lot of growth hacking. But on the other hand, there's also just a lot of content that focuses a lot more on kind of opinion analysis, which is really, really important, but kind of isn't also what we're talking about. I think when you take these two sort of disparate issues, you realize that when it comes down to it, someone's on Google, they're trying to get through their workday. The Tuesday, they need to figure out how to get their onboarding journey right for their subscription product. They're Googling something like that. And there's a lot of stuff, and they kind of get hit with a lot of stuff. A lot of it's either poor quality or a lot of it's just opinion and analysis. And I think that when you get down to that, there isn't really sort of one resource that brings together kind of knowledge, experience, strategies, tactics, and the best practices that everyone in the world kind of, or the world's leading companies, and puts that together in one place and says, okay, here it is on a silver platter. And I think the key here was that we realized, I mean, Jack and I were consulting with a lot of companies over the last year. We worked with a lot of publishers. We worked with a lot of VC firms. We worked with a lot of brands. We worked with a sports team. And we realized that a lot of people kind of had very similar challenges. Yes, their challenges had specific issues with whatever industry they were in. But when it came down to it, kind of everyone has the same problems. And I think you see a lot of this coming up over and over again. And instead of always going for this like expensive consulting approach, there is an
Yeah.
option to say, why don't we just write this down? And I think the last thing I'll say, which was kind of what I just mentioned, is we're writers. Like when we started doing this, we started just writing down everything we found out. And it felt a little bit like this light bulb moment to say, why can't this content come together in a clean, really well presented, well written, fact checked way and just be delivered to people so that it helps them, kind of it drives some outcomes. So that was sort of the birth of Toolkits, really in a nutshell.
So, what are some of those macro problems that you're seeing across brands, publishers, everyone? What are some of the ones that you're seeing there?
I think I'll start with sort of, we basically launched with two coverage areas that we're sort of starting with, but definitely our intention is, and we can talk about this later, to kind of diversify into a whole host of coverage areas. But the two we really started with, kind of really thinking about not even our, just when we started kind of putting this together was, okay, what do we know? And the one big thing we knew is that brand publishing is sort of become this really interesting dynamic in the space right now.
Absolutely.
And I use the word brand loosely because, oh my God, what is a brand? I don't know. But really, any company wants to do content, right?
We'll deep dive what is a brand, what is a creator, because that's something I think both of us have a lot of opinions
You
on here.
you might have to explain it to me later. But basically, I mean, one dynamics that's been interesting is that, and this really happened, after sort of my last day at Digiday, and then I kind of took a few weeks off, and then sort of said, okay, like maybe I'll see like if anybody wants kind of my help. And really, this is one thing that is important to me because this is like a testament to how kind people really are. I think after all these years kind of working in this industry, I didn't really sort of have a moment where I like sort of put out my shingle or I said, okay, I'm open for business. I really didn't do that because we were really focused on sort of figuring out sort of toolkits and everything like that at the beginning. But I will say people were so kind and so many people reached out and so many people started saying, actually, we need help with this. Can you do this? And I surprised myself with how many times I was able to say yes. It's like, wait,
Cool.
I do know how to do that. That's amazing. You don't remember these things until sort of you quit a job, I think, and realize all the things you know how to do. But some of the problems we were noticing was one big one was kind of the strategic part. Okay, we want to do publishing. Somebody's told me I should be doing more content, but I don't know where to start. I don't know how to figure out what my target audience is. I don't know how to come up with an editorial mission. Kind of that really nitty gritty stuff that entirely
Yeah,
honestly and kind of disappointingly gets left aside when people start thinking of this.
for sure.
I think there's an enthusiasm in saying, let's go out and shoot that video or start my podcast. And then there isn't this idea of like, wait, what is this for? What is the outcome?
Right.
And I think this is really important for especially brand publishers. I think the outcomes can be really different for them versus sort of a newsroom. And then everything kind of laddered down through that. So even if you go to toolkits.com and you go to that brand publishing coverage area, it sort of like ladders down from there. It's okay, start with the strategy. Then start with how are you going to structure this team? Like a lot of people have never worked with editors or editorial types before. How do you structure a team to ensure quality and consistency and momentum at the same time? How do you hire people? Hiring journalists and former journalists is sort of an art in and of itself because it's a very different mindset than a lot of brand publishers have been used to. Right down to everything from what are the rules for making good content? What are the rules for translating that content into events and so on? Entirely honestly, even after launch, we've heard so much more from people who've said, okay, we found this really useful. And then we always go back and say, okay, what else are you having problems with? And then it's everything
Cool.
from email newsletters, which we're working on a guide for, to something more around measurement and metrics. So I think everyone's kind of in that same space right now.
So historically, creating content or putting things out would fall into the communications team or maybe a combination of the communications and the marketing team. Where are you finding the companies are placing this bet? And where would you suggest, if you had your druthers with any company, where would you suggest they put this?
Oh, I always want my druthers. So I think you're right. I think, again, it's been interesting because, and I think this is what the beauty of sort of doing your own thing is. Like, I feel like over the past year, I ended up working for essentially 10 companies in 1 year. And
Yeah.
we sort of saw some of them were tiny, some of them were huge, some of them were Fortune 500, some of them are like starting out. But I think all of them really start with this where you said, which is they think, okay, we've got to do content. It is marketing, and it is. I don't think that
Mhm.
there's anything wrong with that. It is marketing, so let's put it in that communications function. And I think that works. In fact, many times I've sort of said, okay, if you've got a CMO or somebody in that role who really understands this, they can be sort of the point person. That being said, I think 9 times out of 10, I have always kind of had to pry out of that a little bit and say, fine, have it sit within the department, but kind of have it operate as almost like a business on its own and
Yeah.
incubate it within that department. So definitely hire an editorial director or an editor in chief, whatever you want to call it. Because entirely honestly, the point is that these are different capabilities and these are different jobs. And the language is important, right? Like we talk a lot about the language part when we work with people too. It's like, yeah, they are editors. You need to think of them as editors versus something else. You need to think of them even as reporters versus copywriters. Like all of these languages and creating that department that works on its own and works at least quite autonomously is sort of the only way to make sure that this gets a fair shot. Because otherwise,
Yeah.
publishing kind of runs the risk of falling into all the other marketing buckets and just
Yeah.
has different rules, right? Just has completely different thinking behind it.
So how are you getting journalists and others in the creative field to buy in to, hey, go work for one of these large brands and create original work for them?
Yeah, it's a good question. So we do work with, I should have mentioned this before, the one things we've done with the consulting side of the business is we've sort of set up a network of just partners, really just people that we've met over our years of working in this industry that we love and like, and including kind of a recruiting partner that we work with when people sort of get to
Great.
that stage. So with a lot of people, we go through this strategic stage. They become even sort of toolkits subscribers, they subscribe to our content and everything. And then they get to the point they're like, okay, we want to do this. And the first step is usually, okay, you need to hire someone. And by the way, like your existing recruiting team probably doesn't know anybody, to your point, in that journalism space. So,
Hmm.
we've sort of a few times had to sort of just refer recruiters to them. I will say this is not for everyone. I know, like, as a journalist myself, I completely understand that, like, going and saying, okay, I'm going to go work for a brand isn't necessarily what is in people's career paths. For a lot of people, they are focused
Yeah.
rightly on saying, I want to be a journalist. I don't want to be in publishing for a company. Even if they're calling it brand journalism, there is a big difference. So it's not for everyone. I think what convinces the people that, at least that I've heard from who've gone into this, has been, for one, I think there's an interesting challenge, which is you kind of get to be on the inside.
Yeah.
For my entire career as a reporter, I was essentially on the outside, right? There is a natural adversarial relationship, even with the sources you love. So you're always kind of trying to pry out information. In this case, you sort of have the information handed to you, which appeals to people. I think people, particularly who've come out of sort of trade journalism, this can be a really interesting kind of career move where you kind of get to be on the inside. You get to work from the inside of an organization versus the outside. And then you still get to do, ideally, if it's set up right, you still get to kind of report within the confines of that. You still get to do that. So I think that appeals to some people. Depending on the company it is, I know that a lot of people are excited by the idea of working inside, for example, a venture capital firm that's doing a lot of publishing because they get exposure to a bunch of founders and a bunch of portfolio companies that in a way that, they might not as business journalists. So that's been one thing I've heard from people who've gone that way. And, in the case of sort of just some people, entirely honestly, it's the fact that you might make a lot more money, to
Right.
be quite blunt. I think that that is not something that escapes people. I think the other thing is, like, we're not sort of in the business of saying brand publishing is the future. I think that the interesting part about brand publishing is that it's actually opened up an opportunity for journalists inside
Yeah.
journalism organizations, because it's sort of like, well, they can do the brand publishing stuff and we can do the hard stuff of investigative journalism and real great sourcing and stuff like that. So I think overall, this is like a real opportunity for, I think, the true believers to sort of go where they should, and kind of this unblurring of lines. I think the lines are going to get unblurred finally after years of, like, where we didn't know what we were reading. We're finally there. And I think it's really exciting.
That's great. And for a company that's doing it right, what is the end goal here, right? Because I believe in this and I think it's the right way in the future. And I've pointed to, there's companies like Dollar Shave Club that started Mel Magazine, which is fantastic. But
So
then they
good.
ultimately realized they weren't making money on it and they felt like it was a sunk cost. So they sold it for parts, unfortunately. And it's alive again. But then you look at it, and I love using Complex as an example because, people under 30 don't realize that Complex was a brand publisher for Mark Echo.
Right.
to sell skateboarder and hip
Yeah.
hop clothes. Should that be the goal of brands to say, okay, we're going to get to a point where this could actually return the investment and make money? Or is it more about brand building, brand awareness, and getting the story right?
I think the goals definitely change. For services businesses that have done this, so people in the ad agency world, particularly communications world, kind of PR firms, et cetera, that are going in deep into brand publishing, for them, success is sort of measured by just they add publishing into one of their core capabilities in a way that's
Mhm.
really interesting for me. I think, again, these are the people who I think are doing it really right. So they're saying to their clients, like, you come to us for, say, this is a PR firm, for great PR advice, et cetera, and we help you. And this is like across DC, and we're working with politicians to do this, et cetera. Now, added to our capabilities are also a bunch of intelligence and thought leadership that we produce that gives you a leg up as well. So it's actually added in as a core capability versus becoming just a marketing for the company. So I think that's a really good goal and outcome. I think the fact is that takes years to do. Essentially, you're building up a
Right.
capability to say, our expertise can be translated into content. So I think that's a really good goal, particularly for services businesses. For others, I think it's a pure sense of like, okay, we are in industries where people don't really cover us. Instead of this like adversarial relationship with the media situation, it's actually just like, okay, we're in a pretty wonky business. We work on something super niche. Nobody really covers this stuff. We're never going to get press or PR or anything like that anyway. So the goal is simply to say, okay, let's make sure people know we're interesting and fun because
Yeah.
nobody else really thinks we are. So some people, honestly, it's a pure talent issue. I think people want to work at companies who are able to explain what they do in a well articulated fashion, who are able to create content that's exciting.
So it's a recruitment tool to get others to work at the company.
Yeah, I
Okay,
think
cool.
exactly. Recruitment is one that I've definitely heard of. Actually, I think some Silicon Valley companies always, I think, traditionally done a really good job at that. I mean, I'm reminded of sort of like engineering blogs, which are like the original
Right.
brand publishers in a way.
Yeah.
And I think engineering blogs were this amazing tool for a lot of companies to sort of show off, and other engineers would read them. Like I wouldn't read them, my husband would read them, and he would be like, "Oh my god, this is so exciting! Like, look at the cool stuff they're doing." And I think talent recruitment, especially for engineering talent, publishing can be a really important and interesting part of that. So a good outcome is often, did we get talent because of this? And
Right.
are we able to sort of use that? I think I'll use the last one, sort of, this is sort of probably the rarest one I've seen, but internally, a lot of people want to make money off this. We are seeing people now get to the point that they say, okay, we've created a big brand publishing operation. We still have clients, but can we paywall some of this and sell this as content? And one of our second coverage areas actually focused on subscription publishing. My co-founder, Jack Marshall, used to run subscription products at Digiday and has worked with a lot of publishers in the last year to set up sort of paywall strategies, subscription strategies, growth strategies. And one thing that we've seen sort of our worlds collapse here into one, which is we've seen obviously publishers get into subscriptions, but also more and more brand publishers. I have heard some interest in say, okay, 2022 planning, let's put a paywall on some of this content. Let's see if we can sell some of this thought leadership as bona fide real content. So I think that's an interesting outcome. The last one I'm probably the most excited and interested in, but it's probably the rarest one.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about that subscription, right? Because I think, especially, brand publishing and subscription, there's the adage, if you build it, they'll come. There's a lot more platitudes than practice going on right now, especially what I lovingly call the think boys, the people who write these 25 tweet thread on how to do it. And you realize, like, okay, you haven't really done it. Where like you and Jack did it at Digiday for
Right.
years and built it up. What do you think most people are missing when they start a newsletter, or they start a podcast, or they start a video blog about their company? What are the things, the real nitty gritty practicing tools that most miss out on?
This is going to sound really, really boring, but honestly, it's just make good stuff.
Yeah.
So, I sort of listen to all these amazing things people talk about, and I'm so excited and interested in like really fantastic onboarding, amazing welcome emails, great journeys, targeting people, a lot of paid acquisition, obviously, for a lot of companies into this. So there's a lot of tools and tactics I think people are using. I will say at the end of the day, everyone is going to figure out those tools and tactics. They're going to figure out at different paces and different parts. I mean, internally, I say we have guides that people really love, that people buy, on how to onboard subscribers, how to do a really good job of addressing password sharing. Like, how do you figure out that tactic when people do that and you get frustrated by that because you notice one person is using, 20 people are
I know
using
that's the bane of Digidays.
it's the bane of everyone's existence.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting, actually. Jack does actually make an argument in one of the pieces that he recently wrote about how, like, this might not actually be a bad thing, and that I thought was just fascinating. And password sharing might actually be a good thing depending on your overall business. But I think one of the interesting things is there are tactics, and the right tactics can help you get ahead, and people should be as kind of well versed as possible, and they should read our guides, and they should talk to people, and they should read the tweet threads, and they should find out. But nothing will ever kind of replace just creating good content. And I think great examples are to be found. The Wall Street Journal just did what is probably one of the best pieces of reporting, we've seen in years on the Facebook files. I don't know the answer. I'm not sure they've told anybody yet, but I would guess that something like that drives reader growth, that drives reader revenue, because that was truly incredible journalism that it's changing everything. It's causing sort of government people to set up. It's causing people to rethink everything. Great work changes minds, and great work, when done right, can drive money and drive revenue. And I think that sort of just having that is probably the thing people sort of know, but like don't really know.
Yeah, I love that. But I feel like that's a massive hurdle, right? Because oftentimes very good work, I'll click and it goes, oh, subscribe to the LA Times. Sorry, LA Times. But I'm like, not today.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll wait a little bit for this. So, that paywall does become deterrent for really good content, right? And maybe, yes, okay, Pulitzer winning piece that is groundbreaking and dropping so much tea on Facebook. Okay, I'll pay for that. That nuance, that area of very good versus great. How do you help train companies to understand the benefit of very good content, very good, consistent content that'll eventually turn into great content?
I think there's a couple of things. I think one is that, I think despite sort of preaching the gospel of subscriptions, subscriptions work, I think, most effectively as part of an overall revenue mix. I think that is one thing that sort of, at least for a lot of people, maybe there isn't a full understanding of that, or a full sort of acceptance of that, but like sort of never say never. So subscriptions have to be part of a fully baked strategy. And that means not always discounting depending on your business, not discounting advertising, not discounting sponsored content, not discounting events and things like that. So I think that's sort of the one kind of big mindset shift that we've talked to people about, and that is worth sort of repeating. I think second is sort of creating different classes of content, creating work that is sort of really focused on sort of that enterprise subscription that is going to get people to pull out their corporate card because they can't do their jobs without it, kind of thing. So I think you see sort of doing that versus not paywalling then the regular general interest LA Times story that you just talked about. So I think there's different types of content that deserves different treatments. And also there's always a spectrum. I mean, there are meters, there are different ways of doing this that ensure that content is still seen and stories are still being read while not fully shutting anybody out, to your point. And I think there are a lot of different sort of levers that are able to be pulled. I think the question is always like, which combination of which lever at what time needs to be pulled in order for my goals at that specific moment. And I think that's what sort of, Jack definitely talks about quite a bit, is we do have to sort of tell people, and we do this in a lot of our toolkits and our guides as well, is that like, this is never going to be the 100% solution. This is always going to be 80%, because you have to take a look at your entire thing holistically in order to make that decision. But I hear you. I think a lot of people get understandably worried about traffic dropping. I hear reporters who don't, lots of reporters hate having paywalls on their work because they are like, well, nobody's reading this anymore. So I think that reader revenues should and must be part of an overall kind of mix of strategies. And at the same time, people have to kind of always be cognizant that the levers have to be pulled differently.
So you practice what you preach on Toolkits. You provide free content. I want to get a little nerdy and wonky with that, right? Because a lot of, especially solopreneurs or partner consulting groups, have very intentionally vague websites to be more of a catch-all, right? Like I fell into that as well when I first launched our website, where it's just like, sure, we can do anything, but you're very specific, and you also give a really good amount away. Is that an intentional tool to drive people to say, okay, cool, if they're giving me this, there must be more?
Yeah. I mean, entirely honestly, everything I just talked about is stuff we just believe in, truly. Like, we believe good content will drive subscriptions. We believe that good work will drive the guides in the same way. At the same time, like, we're both writers. Firstly, we have to write. I think that's the other thing. Like, we love to write. We need to write. Instead of writing on Twitter, we're writing somewhere else. So I think that's one. And yeah, I mean, we have essentially 2 weekly newsletters for each of our verticals right now, with the hopes of sort of bringing that onto any future verticals that we'll do. The one thing I do believe in is that a lot of this knowledge does need to be democratized. Even when we're thinking about what our next project will be, et cetera, it's like a lot of this work should be useful. And at no point do we want to and should we bait and switch people into sort of clicking a link and getting hit with a paywall. If you click a link, I mean, 9 times out of 10, you'll get something. We'll never not get anything.
Yeah.
So a significant part of that is open. And that's just, I think we have to be our best practitioners of what we preach. And if we're going to be telling people how to do things, then we should be doing them too. And I think our past work shows that, but also if you go to the site, you hopefully see that too.
It absolutely does show, and it definitely feels intentional, and you go, oh, I want to learn
you.
more from these folks.
Thank you. Good. I'm glad.
So you and Jack got excited, you dug in, you are off to the races and doing all this work. What do you miss most, though, about leaving Digiday and leaving behind a structure of support and other folks that can help out on projects?
I think Digiday is a fantastic company, and I am forever grateful to Nick Fries and Brian Marcy and literally everybody I worked with in the 6 years I was there. I think the pandemic had this like effect. This is not news. Everyone's going to really like, oh, great, the pandemic. But, it really did. I was among the luckiest people to not have certain things that other people were going through. And I'm very cognizant and very grateful for that on an everyday basis. I think that there was also just this reckoning. It kind of felt like a lot of things accelerated. Eventually I think everyone's career changes and moves, but I definitely felt for myself personally a sense of acceleration on, okay, what am I doing next? What am I doing? What didn't help, I'll tell you, Keith, was the fact that my husband quit his job where he'd been for 12 years. He quit his job in February. So pre-pandemic, he had big plans. He was going to travel. He was going to do all this. And then just like right before, and then the pandemic happened. So he was sitting at home. He was sitting sort of in the room, kind of down the hall, and just sort of chilling for a little bit. And then he started a new job in April, and he started it remotely. So a month after really the pandemic really got going here. So this was like the throes of New York being hit by, that we were hearing sirens all day, and he started this new job. He started remotely, and I sensed in him this like excitement, and he started at a startup, and this excitement and this kind of this fire in his voice. We've been married for a very long time. Like that I just hadn't heard. I had never heard in his voice before because he'd been at this other company. And he really liked that old company. He loved his coworkers. There was nothing wrong. And I sometimes I say this to people, and I know this was not what you asked, but there doesn't have to be something wrong in order to move on. Things can evolve in a way that, just it's a conscious uncoupling. I hate that. I can't believe I just said that, but it really felt like that. So I think that was it. I've always sort of dreamt that, I'd love to run my own thing. It would be so exciting. I don't think I would have done this on my own. We were talking about this earlier, but I know you had Claire Mazur on your podcast before, and, talking about sort of finding the right partner and finding sort of the right person. And I really believed in sort of some of the things she said. I know she talks about sort of female friendships, and I have a male co-founder, but I think one of the things is like people do talk a lot about like technical skills. You have the complement of skills. But I think more than anything, like having a partner who you are friends with and who you genuinely enjoy spending time with.
Absolutely.
I'm just so grateful to have it, and I'm so happy to have it. It's just one of the nicest things. And I think it makes work feel fun. It makes even talking to our accountant feel pretty fun, because we have to talk to our accountant a lot more now than I used to ever get to do that. It makes like working in QuickBooks, which is like, what is this system? Don't know how this works. Really a lot more fun. It makes talking to trademark lawyers fun. It just makes all these things just feel a lot more fun. And I think that is vastly underestimated. So to answer your question, I miss certain things, but I sort of miss them as the way you kind of miss high school or college or a different part of your life, where I enjoyed it and I loved it. But I am so excited that I get to do this, because I get to work kind of for myself, but have sort of someone that is a coworker. And I think lastly, a lot of people, we still have GChat. We talk all day. I have coworkers who are not coworkers anymore. We're literally at random companies throughout the world who are still my coworkers somehow. So that's been nice.
It sounds like invoicing still doesn't turn into fun.
Why is it so hard? Like how,
Yeah, it really is.
despite all this, I mean, Intuit, essentially, if they're listening, I don't know what is going on. Why is it so difficult?
Yeah. And I'd love to go there with you a little bit right now. And in terms of like the surprise things that come with starting your own company, right? Especially, I've talked to people who have raised a lot of money so they can hire pretty darn quickly. But then I've talked to people who are really comfortable being two-person companies or one-person companies, but you take on all these new responsibilities. What were some of those things that you took on and you go, oh, wow, I didn't know I was going to be doing this many hours a week?
I will say, I remember because you wrote, Keith, I think I remember this. You wrote this really like, this like cheat sheet almost that I really liked. I
Yeah.
want to say like a while ago, like a year and a half ago.
Yeah. A couple of years ago, like
Okay.
72 people read it.
No, but I read it. I remember reading it, and I was sort of
I
like, "Oh
appreciate that.
man, whenever I do this, like I gotta write this down," because that was a little scary. I think like your stack, is sort of
Yeah.
hard and weird to figure out. We did a lot of things, and entirely honestly, like I'm gonna write this down because I think it's just useful, and you should write more of these down too because you've done this too. Like we got our LLC through Atlas, we
Mhm.
got it out the box. Actually, it's funny because Dan Frommer, the new consumer, wrote about the exact
Yep.
same problem that he had, which is he did the same thing as us, then realized like I live in New York, Jack lives in New Jersey, so we have to re-register the company in a different state.
Yeah.
So had to do that. Like in retrospect, was that the right call? At some point you realize like no idea, you just sort of move on. You just
Yep.
move on as quickly as
Yeah.
possible. I think those are some of the things that I didn't really like think would be this difficult. I think there's an interesting dynamic that happens when you have two people running a company and essentially you are, 50-50, but you know that there are some things the other person just knows better than you. So you kind of
Yeah.
have to come up with like a system to stop yourself from going around in circles. Because at some point, one person has to say, okay, it's decision time, and you are making
Yeah.
the decision. I think that took us a while. And I think part of this is because we're also friends. We just always, we have been for a very long time. So I think doing that and making sure we weren't spending a ton of time kind of on the small stuff. It's a nice time to launch a company. This stuff isn't the hard stuff. I think the hard stuff is really what it's like, why are we here? What is our mission? Why are
Exactly.
we doing this? And why is this important? And I'm really, really happy we took time to kind of think through why this was so important and why Toolkit solves a real problem before we sort of like jumped in head first and said, we're launching a company. Our last day at Digiday was last summer, and we spent a year consulting with a lot of publishers and a lot of companies, but we were working on this as well. And so it was nice to come out and say, we've done this for a year. We're only telling you about it now. We've already done this. And that was a really good thing, I think.
Did you guys leave it right at the same time?
I think there was a little bit of a gap. Yeah, there
Okay.
was a little bit of a gap. And, both of us really did leave with the intention of sort of separately kind of just figuring out, doing consulting and talking to people and kind of seeing what else was sort of out there. I mean, at the time, I remember speaking to people and saying, I want to like widen my aperture. I've been at this company for 6 years
Yeah.
where I'd done, so many different roles. I was so lucky.
And you did so much.
Thank you. And it was just like, it was
Yeah, that
just
was
a
great.
lot of work for a minute. I was like, my God, I've done everything. I don't know what to do now. And the pandemic and being here, and when you strip the commute out of it, you strip the getting dressed for work out of it, you strip the parties. I used to go to a lot of events. I used to go to a lot of drinks and dinners and lunches. Once all that goes away, you realize what the job is.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think that's a unique moment that you have to say, okay, what am I really doing? And is this what I want to continue to be doing? And it was a really good time to do that.
I love that. It's so true, right? Like there's all these other, especially in the media advertising world, there's so many of these intangibles that keep you in or lure you back. So at the same time you were doing this, there were so many other great writers and editors who decided to leave their company and start their own Substack, which is great. I'm enjoying them. I'm subscribing to a lot and really enjoying the freedom of their writing. Some of them, it reminds you that they do need editors like you. But why did you and Jack go, okay, this is not just a Substack. This is not just us, writing thought pieces. Why did you want to open your aperture, as you say, to go work with companies versus doing the Substack route that so many other writers and editors did?
I don't think it was, I wouldn't describe it as sort of like this intentional decision, like not this, but this. I think over time I realized how to do things. Somebody gave me this great advice. Rupal Parekh, who is now at Working Co, but used to be my editor years and years ago when I worked at Crane, sort of said, one thing you should do is just sit down and write down everything you know how to do. And I thought it was a really weird exercise. Like, I was like, oh, and I had this blank sheet of paper. And I was like, what do I know how to do? But then over time, it's like, wait, I know how to do things, right? And I started writing all these things down. And a lot of them fell into this, well, if I know how to do this, do other people need to know how to do this? And, of course, there were people that said, okay, are you looking for a full-time job? And do you want to have a conversation? And there were really nice people out there who sort of came to me and talked to me about that. But I think when I sort of said, oh, actually, I know how to do these things, I started creating essentially a menu for myself. You realize all the things you need, and then you match it with other people's needs. And if there's a need, then you can go do something. And you can go do something with them on an advisory basis. You can go do something for them just for free. If you just want to help someone out, sure. You can do something for them full time. But I think that was sort of one. And then I think coming back to this problem that we kept coming back to, there is a problem where information is, despite living in sort of the most information rich context ever, information is stunningly difficult to find.
Yeah.
And you've seen this done. This is not sort of a novel idea. You've seen people do this in an amazing way. I think, like Dotdash has done it in a great way when it comes to like health stuff and Very Well Health, and say, okay, information's hard to find on specific things. So let's make it easier to find, make it well packaged and so on. So this isn't a novel idea. But when it comes to practical guidance for business, it just wasn't there. So it felt a little bit like, I don't think the conversation was ever, is it Substack or something? It was just, okay, there are problems, let's solve them. And to your point, I think I was lucky enough to have, Jack, who knew how to do sort of setting up all these things and making sure it's sort of presented in the best way possible. So I think thinking about technical skills, there was a really nice fit there. So it just made sense to buy the .com and go for it.
Yeah, those are always some of the more fun parts of building a company in retrospect, of sitting there and whiteboarding names and figuring out who owns the URL and do you want to pay that amount of money for it?
Completely.
Earlier in the hour, we said we are going to go there, so I do want to go there on the idea of the creator economy. There's a lot of people that are talking big talk that everyone should be a creator. Everyone should do that. Do you agree with that? Do you think everyone should be a creator, or should some of us just be in the audience and appreciate other people's genius?
I think everyone can create. I think the question is, do people want to buy what you're creating? I think everyone is a creator. Right. At the same time, being able to support themselves while remaining just a creator, it feels hard. It feels hard even when you sort of start a business, and it feels hard no matter, I think, at what stage you are in at some point. I think the fact is there's always going to be sort of a 1%, 2% of people who are going to just be able to do that and make a living and support their families. And there's another percentage that won't, but they will supplement. I don't think the sort of the one job, kind of one career thing is something that's going to keep going. I think people are going to be doing different things. And I don't think it's a side hustle. Like, I take issue with that word. I don't think it's a hustle. I think it's generally people create, and they'll create in multiple ways. And maybe 9 to 3, they'll create at work, and 3 to 9, they'll create somewhere else. But it is hard to think of a world where everyone can just like work on their own and be able to survive, because at some point things are going to run out.
The part of that I'm like so positive and I feel optimistic about is this idea that we're kind of breaking down the walls of the side hustle, right? Of you have to hide that you're doing this other thing, or even you have to do this other thing to make enough money that it can kind of blend into your other day job, or it can blend into what you're doing, and everybody's got a multi-hyphen it.
Exactly. I mean, have you heard of that site that helps people like have 2 jobs at the same time? It's fantastic. It's like, there's a site that has practical guidance for how to get this done. I'm telling you, there's something to it. I'm a big fan.
My favorite thing in that was one of the bullet points is be mediocre. I just love that. Because
you can't be a superstar. Like,
exactly. You can't be a superstar. You can't ask for things. You can't ask for, like, don't go for the promotions. Don't be in the top 5%.
There's something beautiful to mediocrity. I don't know. Sometimes I really do understand that feeling. So
yeah, the friends that I have happiest in advertising sales in that world are like, I never want to be a CRO. I never want to be an SVP of sales. I want to sell and have a great balanced life.
That's a really good point. I think people's just natures of growth are different. I think it's okay to not just have what you do be kind of the only measure of your success.
Right.
Maybe your job is funding something else, and that's okay. I think that's better than okay. That's fantastic.
Yeah. And I think we're starting to finally understand that and recognize that even I've seen now, like when people are gathering at places, people are talking less about jobs, which is kind of cool and healthy. We're talking about different things.
Very healthy.
So with your work at Digiday and other places, you talk to probably hundreds of people in marketing and brands and publishing side. And one of the things that I've always like kind of cynically laughed at is like the obsession with what's next in the future when they're so mediocre at the current. Why do you think that is? Why can't anybody focus in on what's happening now rather than talking about NFTs and cryptocurrency and the next big thing?
That's a really good question. I think because everyone wants a fresh start, everyone sort of thinks that they'll do
Yeah.
better, in the future. So if they talk about the future, then they sort of don't have to focus on the problems that are here now, which they are actively probably a part of. I mean, I'm sure everyone's guilty of this. I mean, people have asked me before, like, what do you expect? I'm just scared of making predictions because I'm so afraid of being wrong. And I wish more people were afraid of being wrong, entirely honestly. Maybe this is like imposter syndrome or whatever. But I think on marketing, from people I've spoken to that have asked this, I think it's the shiny big thing syndrome. I think there's a culture right now that's prized kind of big talk and talking about how big you're going to get and how the next thing is going to make you big and what the next future is around. There is a culture that prizes bullshitters. The bullshitters happen to look a certain way. They happen to be from certain places and they happen to sort of all sound the same, but they all kind of prop each other up. And therefore, if you talk about the future, then you don't have to worry about the problems of the present. And it's neat and it's clean and you still come off super smart. But that's the cynical part of me. The other part of me thinks like,
Yeah.
maybe they're really, really smart and they know everything. But that's just my theory.
I try to put all my cynicism into and out on Twitter so that I don't have it in the rest of my life. But the Aussie media stuff I'm obsessed with, mainly because, yes, the things that Carlos and co were doing were way out of bounds, especially the YouTube executive stuff. But there was a lot of the practices that people were breathlessly tweeting and talking about. I was like, there's a dozen companies I know that did this exact same thing that you're celebrating.
Completely.
And I'll get specific now because it just is, the timeliness is hilarious on this. But, there's a breathless story about Mike.com having their Lazarus moment in the New York Times 10 days after this investigative report came out. And it's just a very interesting dynamic on like who gets to have that comeback and why, right? Like, do we need Mike.com right now? I don't know.
Yeah, it is interesting to think about basically reckonings, right? Like we use that word reckoning a lot. We've used it in this case, like this is a reckoning against kind of, inflated numbers and grandstanding and so on, a reckoning against. Our favorite story that we used to tell people to do at Digiday was to go back a year later. And always, like, no matter what it was. I mean, it's be like, hey, this person said this a year later. Just do a year later story. And I wish more people did this. By the way, I think like everyone should do these stories constantly. It's just because a year later, that reckoning system magically disappeared. And, people talk about how this is just the beginning of more scrutiny on X practice, whatever that practice is. I hope it's true. I hope it happens. I hope that people become introspective, whatever. But I think 9 times out of 10, that doesn't really happen. And you're right. Like, who gets to have that? But I think that's a great opportunity for especially reporters and sort of, I hate the word sort of trade publication, but who do work in B2B, who focus on these industries and know these people to sort of come back always and say, so what happened? You made all these big comments when the Aussie media story broke. What did you do? What happened to that moment? And I think it would be a worthwhile exercise to sometimes look backwards versus sort of always talking about the future. That might be one thing.
Yeah. I mean, one of the biggest ones right now, and I'd love your opinion on this, is Black Lives Matter and the advertising community saying we're going to do better. We're going to fund more Black-owned businesses and we're going to be more thoughtful about our hiring practices. When I talk to Black leaders at different companies and Black employees, they're like, not much has changed except I have a lot more focus groups that I have to talk at.
Yeah, completely.
So why can't companies kind of stick to the things that they say they're going to do?
Entirely honestly, I don't think anybody sits down and comes up with a strategy for how they're going to do it. It's like talk about like brand publishing strategy. It's like, where do you start? I think people sort of coming back to my like terrible metaphor here, but just like people are always intent on like, well, let's launch the video. They're always like, well, let's launch the focus group. It's like, well, wait, not a lot of people actually sit down and say, how are we going to do it? What exactly is the problem? And why is it important to fix? How is it going to happen? Who's going to own this? Who's going to take charge of this? There's rarely sort of an owner assigned to these things. And therefore, there's rarely kind of responsibility. It has to be part of someone's job description beyond the sort of chief diversity officer. Also, what does it mean to be more diverse? I mean, I can tell you the number of times I've been called a diverse person. I don't really know what that means.
You can't be.
I'm not really. I am one race. So I'm not sure I am quite diverse. But the number of times sort of I think being a stand-in, it makes me uncomfortable when I'm a stand-in for like someone who is of Hispanic origin or someone who's Black, and I'm just like, wait, I can't be a stand-in for other groups. Like this is ridiculous. I'm none of these things. So I think there's just a misunderstanding, and why people don't solve is like, I don't think anybody actually sits down or is incentivized to sit down and figure it out. There's an incentive misalignment in general in work on how much of the company you own, and therefore you're incentivized to work there, how much you're paid, and therefore you're incentivized to work harder, and how much you're paid to solve the problem, and therefore you're incentivized to solve it. And I think that's one big reason people become creators or owners, and because they say, well, at least that way my incentives align. I have to do a good job because my incentives are fully aligned with this company. And that just doesn't exist in most relationships.
I love that. Thank you. I read this quick interview with former CEO of Pepsi on the New York Times this morning. I think she's coming out with a book about her experience there. They went there with the Kendall Jenner part of Pepsi, and her response back was, we were trying to connect the communities. We were trying to bring the communities together, and we missed. And, again, cynical hat on, I go, should a carbonated sugar beverage company be in charge of connecting communities and bringing communities? Like, should they be focused on that? Like, brand purpose would be like big B, big P. Should that be the values of a CPG company, or should they just go, hey man, we make a product that you think is delicious, and that's all we bring to the table?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I do think that people expect more. I know there's a lot of data around this. People do expect more from companies. So in some ways, some part of me, you're right. I think I've written about this. It's like, what does a carbonated brand have to do with like world peace? But also in some ways, it's like, I completely agree. It's like, what does it have to do? Just sell your carbonated brand. On the other hand, if they get it right, I do think the payoff can be pretty large. So I think a lot of people sort of say, let's try and get it right. But then when they get it wrong, it's sort of, okay, I'm sure it hurt them, but like, did it a lot? I don't know. I haven't seen the numbers. I do think that there is something to the overall, like, people expect things from their brands, they expect things from their employers. I don't think anybody is looking at them to like save the world by any means.
Right.
But I think that there is this idea that like, let's try it, because if we get it right, then everyone will write about us and everyone will think we're so amazing. But the people usually making those decisions are, not the right people. And then that comes back to sort of the diversity and all of that issues, like who was in the room, who actually made that call, who said nothing, like, and I think it's the saying nothing, right? Are people incentivized to say this is a bad idea, or are people incentivized to just nod? It depends on the company, but in many places, my guess would be everyone's just incentivized to say, yeah, this is a great idea.
You've interviewed so many people, especially live, right? Like you've done panels and one-on-one fireplace chats as well as podcasts. How quickly do you know, because you talked about this industry of bullshitters, how quickly do you know that you're being bullshitted? And how do you, as an interviewer, as somebody that wants to uncover truth, how do you tackle that?
I think you just assume everyone's bullshitting, to be honest. You start with that. I've never thought about this, to be honest, but I think I've just always assumed everyone is. And a lot of this, I will say, I'm not blaming him, but I will like attribute this one to being under the sort of the school of Brian Morrissey. It's like, just assume everyone's bullshitting until they sort of prove you otherwise. So I think that's a good
life lesson. Yeah.
Entirely. I think more reporters should do that. I think it taught me a lot, certainly when I did that. If they are doing it, then ask the right questions. But at some points, sometimes people are just too trained in bullshit and you can't get past it. I think sometimes it's just, you have to kind of chalk it up. But it's interesting, right? Some people have become so well media trained that when you read their Q&As, it's like, no matter what questions you asked, you wouldn't have been able to get past this. It's an art. It's incredible, which is where kind of a Q&A maybe wasn't the best format for this story. Right. So I think there's ways around it that end up just probably meaning more work, but are just the way sort of things go.
Yeah. I had a buddy who, I'll give him a shout out, JP, Jonathan Perlman, who worked in politics before he went over to work in media and worked with Cory Booker. And he just said, just say you're asking the wrong question and then move on to what you said. And it was so smooth when he did it.
Oh, I like that one. I'm going to write it down.
But whatever they asked, if it was not on topic, he would just say, well, that's the wrong question. What we really want to talk about is this. And I just love it so much. And I see people they might not say those words out loud, but that's what they're doing in their head. Like, nah, that's not what I'm going to answer. I'm going to answer this. So I usually at the end of the podcast ask folks to predict the future of what their company is going to look like in a year. I'm not going to ask you to predict what's going to happen, but I'll frame it a little bit like, what does next year look like ideally for you? If at the end of this year, you look back and you do that retrospective on yourself, what would you go? Fuck yeah, we did it. We did all this stuff.
I think, honestly, I wake up. Jack is so sick of getting this slack from me because I routinely will slack him, just be like, "Can you believe we're doing this?" Because I am just so
That's awesome, man.
freaking excited. I am freaking excited. I'm excited that it's working. I'm excited that, of course, I'm excited there's money, but I'm also just excited that like we did it. I think that's fun and cool. And I think more people should be just excited about things like that when they do things in general. So I definitely subscribe to the school of excitement. So I'm always proud. I think that it's made me proud that we're even here. It'll be great if this continues. It'd be great. Obviously, I want to see growth, but I want to see growth in the right way. We're really focused on creating good content. I think good would be if I look back and I look at all the work we did and it's all at the high standard that the existing work already is, and that people recognize that this is good, this is different, this is unbiased. But yeah, I think that would be great. I think that would make me sort of really happy to have helped create a content business that does what it says it will, where the mission is aligned with the business model and the two sort of work hand in hand and actually help sort of solve problems and also do it in sort of a variety of different areas. That would make me really happy.
Amazing. And if people and companies want to connect with you, what's the best way for them to find you?
It's just Shareen at toolkits.com, and we're at toolkits.com. So hopefully they'll find us.
Amazing. Shareen, thank you so much. It was great seeing you.
It was great to be here. I'm sorry about that. That was Hamilton. Bye.
No worries. No worries. Thank you for listening to The Changeup, produced by Elena Weedland, with original music by Rodney Hazard. If you liked what you heard, we'd appreciate your support by liking, sharing, leaving a comment, and subscribing wherever you listen. Thanks once again. Until next time.